So I'm going to pass it over to Lisa Nichols to introduce the session and our speakers.
Thank you, Sarah. So thank you for joining us for this session and discussion on research security risk mitigation decision tools and processes. If we could go to the next slide. So I'm Lisa Nichols. I'm the Executive Director for Research Security at the University of Michigan, and I'm joined by my co-chairs, Doug Backman for the Research Security Subcommittee, Doug Backman from the University of Central Florida, Sarah Stocker-LaHoo from the National Science Foundation, who will also be one of our speakers today, and Mark Sweet from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Next slide. And so these are our speakers for this morning. So again, Sarah Stocker-LaHoo is the Deputy Chief Research Security and Policy at the National Science Foundation. We'll also be joined by Chris Gardner, the Director for Science and Technology Protection with the Department of Defense, Greg Moffitt, Chief Research Security Officer at MIT, and Michelle Masucci, Vice Chancellor for Research and Economic Development and Professor of Geography and Environmental Systems with the University System of Maryland, and as you all know, the FTP and NFTB co-chair as well. Next slide. So we're going to be moving into our first presentation, and our speakers are going to discuss federal agency and institutional efforts to assess risk that's associated with international activities as they relate to federal awards, to foreign sponsored and non-monetary agreements, or to outside activities. Some of the things we're going to talk about are the tools and processes that are being used. We're also going to hear the faculty perspective and welcome all of your perspectives, both institutional and faculty, as part of this discussion. We're going to have some time for questions and discussion, and then we're also going to hear from Alicia Reed, the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Research Administration from Kansas University, who is going to talk about our survey results. And thanks to everyone who participated in the survey that we released last week. So we're going to talk about what we heard from the community regarding your risk assessment at your institution and the tools and processes that you use and those that you feel that you need. So without further delay, I will turn it over to Sarah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Again, and thank you everyone for hosting this today. It's a pleasure to be here. Just as Lisa mentioned, I'm the Deputy Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy at National Science Foundation. I work for Dr. Rebecca Kaiser, who is the chief. She was appointed back in 2020, and we're in the process of standing up our office as we speak, hiring additional FTEs as we're bulking up and kind of expanding the scope of activities that we're working on already. Also, we just did stand up a website on research security with a ton of resources, and a lot is happening. So please, feel free to stop by and look at that website, and all of our contact information is there as well. Next slide, please. So why are we here today? The perennial question, how do we assess research security risks? Not only that, when it comes to what kinds of risks, what mitigations are possible to address these risks. And I think that question is really so critical as we're looking, across the board and factors that we're considering, because in reality, I think, perhaps it's a cautiously optimistic outlook, but perhaps 90% of the time, even more than that, we can get to yes, right? We just have to think about the possible mitigations to help us get there. Of course, across the board, everyone is asking this question. On the left here, we have the very well-known 2019 JASON study. For any of you that are not aware, the JASON is a group of scientists that have really unique expertise in both national security and also come from the scientific community. So they are a group of experts that we pull upon often. And actually, we have a JASON study underway right now as well, kind of looking at key technology areas that may have access to classified and CUI information, and also another legislative requirement, not only from CHIPS, but also NDA as it relates to what technology areas that NSF funds that may have military or intelligence applications in adversary countries. So a lot is happening, but this group of experts really have been helping us along the way as we're thinking about how we want to think about research security policy and just across the board, addressing risk, what questions that we should be asking, and I'll dive into that a little bit more on the next slide. Also NSPM 33, which many of you know, of course, which issued really the first across the board research security policies for US government agencies, and then which was followed by the implementation guidance, providing other additional guidelines for implementation across the community. And I just also, the third document that's on this slide in front of you is, many of you probably also know, the University Engagement with China and MIT approach. The research community, all of you have been thinking about these issues for quite some time. Everyone is at a different place in where they are, but MIT has been thinking about this issue set for quite some time. I won't dive into that today because I think most of you are familiar, but really, they felt that there was a need to kind of articulate a strategy specific to China, as you can see by the title of this report. And really, they call out a lot of really unique risks, I think, that even us in the US government are kind of toiling with and grappling with as we're moving forward with our policies. So anyway, it's just a fantastic read, and definitely, I think, a critical document as we are kind of moving forward in our own strategy on this as well. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, that first document, the 2019 Jason study, I think it's very important because one of the findings there was there are really good, powerful countermeasures against foreign influence. And there are careful considerations that everyone can be thinking about as they enter into engagements with specific foreign entities and parties. They really assessed that across the board, really, we can be thinking about, this is an assessment tool, right? This is here to kind of help us develop a fuller understanding of what kind of engagement we want to get into. What are the questions we should be asking before a decision is made? Again, this is just one piece of the puzzle, but I wanted to kind of foot stomp this, that this is a readily available public document that can kind of help inform our decision-making in this process, as many of you are thinking about entering into legitimate international collaborations. Next slide, please. So really what I want to focus on today is what is NSF doing now? Some of you may know there is a forthcoming research security policy requirement in the 2024 PAPG, the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, that NSF uses and provides public guidance to the research community on requirements for proposals.
I didn't get this one till 2 minutes ago, so I'm going to share it now.
Oh, okay. I think that was, somebody came off mute by mistake there. So anyway, I will continue on. So as you can see, this is a new requirement in the PAPG, a proposal. There are already a set of factors where that would justify why a proposal will not be accepted or will be returned without review. And now there is a new factor. And as you can see highlighted in bold, if the proposal has the potential to negatively impact research security and integrity due to credible information of a national security concern. Again, there is a footnote here. First and foremost, we envision again that this return without review on this basis will likely be rare. That is the hope. But of course, we don't know yet because this is going to be a new process that we're standing up. And then in addition, we are going to be developing a risk rubric comprised of risk-based indicators to help us inform the basis of our decision-making to make this assessment for national security concerns. This is something that we're going to publish to the community, and we intend to do quite a bit of stakeholder engagement as we are developing this. Again, there are many wonderful reference guides and other U.S. government agencies that are already looking at this problem and making this information public. Of course, additionally, even consulting with other U.S. government agencies that are thinking about this problem set and not making it public. But I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. Next slide, please. One thing we're doing to help inform our thinking on this is we are funding a Science and Technology Policy Institute study, STIPI, to help kind of inform our thinking. Again, the goal is to analyze available data to help us inform our thinking as we are developing a framework for this risk rubric. They're going to be looking at grant proposals, of course. other U.S. government, non-governmental national security and risk-related rubrics, stakeholders' identification of risk factors, and then, of course, other data sources as necessary. Really, they're going to be looking at the question, what are these potential decision-making factors that we should consider as we're making awards? And also given the national security requirements that are articulated and mandated in CHIPS and Science, also NSPM 33. So really hoping to identify the key participants, challenges, and then also making sure that all equities are represented in our analysis and the way that we're thinking about this. For example, perspectives of both, research and science community, institutes of higher education, U.S. government agencies, grant-making agencies, law enforcement, and intelligence community. So we're expecting this is going to be there's going to be quite a bit of analysis going into this, but the good news is, if you can switch to the next slide, is, as I mentioned, we have a lot of precedent here to kind of refer to. This really, there are many U.S. government agencies, risk-based security reviews and rubrics and decision-making tools that are currently available online. Really, this all started with DARPA. They had a risk-based measures rubric to assess potential undue foreign influence, conflicts of interest, and conflicts of commitment. Chris Gardner, my colleague from DoD, who's going to be presenting next, he can kind of correct me here, but I think DARPA was the first one to put this online. And from what I understand, this was really kind of a larger effort, I think, behind the scenes at DoD, but DARPA was really the first one to kind of get some criteria up there about how they were thinking about their decision-making process for proposals and research funding. Department of Army also had a risk assessment program that developed a matrix, and this identified specific actions of senior key personnel, which were of concern. And now, again, so Chris just did confirm that DARPA was the first to go public. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about the new Department of Defense decision matrix, which is now available online. I think that was published, was it just a month ago, 2 months ago? Anyway, actually, no, June. It looks like June 8th, 2023. Again, Chris will kind of walk you through that whole entire process, but this was a huge, huge effort across DoD. And again, this is kind of outlining what are those factors and to help inform the fundamental research proposal mitigation decisions that they're making across DoD, which is no small feat. So, and then in addition, National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, just issued a Safeguarding International Science Research Security Framework. Again, this was just recent. This was after DoD, but I think this was this was just 2 months ago in August, which is a huge undertaking. And again, this provides a large amount of factors that they're thinking about it in their decision-making process. And now, hopefully, very soon, we are going to be releasing our risk rubric. Again, this was published in the 2024 PAFG. It will become effective early 2024 calendar year. And then we will be, again, hoping to get that out in draft form. We're going to be doing a little bit of stakeholder engagement. Again, Chris Gardner from DoD can tell you all about, they did a tremendous amount of stakeholder engagement leading up to their development of the risk rubric. So, so we're very much looking forward to this. Again, this is going to be a kind of an interactive process. There's a lot of criteria that we're considering. And actually on that note, go to the next slide, please. But there's a lot of questions that we're asking here. These are not easy questions, to say the least. And some of the things that we're thinking about: what is the risk that NSF-funded fundamental research might contribute to a human rights abuse? What about potentially research that could contribute to a military or intelligence capability in a country of concern? These are obviously things that we would like to avoid, and we're trying to safeguard that from happening. Also, I do want to also foot stomp again, kind of along the lines of, mitigation, but also one of the questions and factors that we're going to be considering is what is the risk of not collaborating with these foreign partners, right? This is just as much a very critical question that we shouldn't be overlooking as we're thinking about this. And again, trying to figure out the risk of not pursuing it, any options to mitigate. And I think this is going to be, a very extensive process for us. But the good news is we have a lot of people already in the community, and then of course across USG that are thinking about this already. So I will stop there. Go to the next slide, please. I'll open it to questions. I know that there were a number of questions that were popping up in the chat. Sarah, Lisa, I don't know, should I answer those now, or should we wait until after everyone kind of does their presentations and then we can go to those questions?
I think we were going to, thank you, Sarah. I think we were
Great.
going to wait until after the initial 4 presentations and then do the questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
All right, great. Okay, so we will move on to Chris Gardner. And Chris, we know you were on because we saw you in chat. So,
That is why I was just asking for confirmation that somebody could hear me.
and we could not. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa. So I want to thank Sarah, Lisa, and the co-chairs for inviting me. I know there was a discussion yesterday in this event that Jason Day gave a high-level overview with Rebecca Kaiser and some others of this, and Sarah invited me to dive a little bit deeper, should we choose to, on the DoD's policy for risk-based security reviews and what we're doing internally to the DoD to try and drive some consistency for academia on what we're trying to do within the DoD as well. So once again, my name's Chris Gardner. I'm the director for S&T protection, and I work in a office parallel to our fundamental research office or basic research office, Dr. Bindu Nair, who runs that. And go ahead and go next. And as Sarah brought up, is all the federal agencies have been working very hard to try and drive some consistency. One of those was the National Security Presidential Memorandum 33. Well, that was released in June of 21, and it's now 2023, and we're still trying to work out through some consistent implementation guidance that is at least consistent across the federal interagency. Within the Department of Defense, we have at least 5-6 independent organizations that also execute fundamental research and award them out. And one thing we wanted to ensure is that the exposure from the department out was consistent. And so that's why as Sarah mentioned, in June of this year, Ms. Shu released the policy for risk-based security reviews for fundamental research. And part of that was to drive the consistency within the department, but also be transparent to academia on what we were being asked and how we're going to evaluate for risk the grants and the proposals that come in. So as was mentioned, and you can see on the slide, this information is all public. You can see both the DoD press release and a link to that one, and then a link to the actual documents themselves, which actually is in 3 parts. And I'll actually go briefly into each one of them momentarily as well. But there's the policy for the risk-based security reviews, which is more direction to the internal DoD about how to drive our own consistency. The second one that has driven a lot of interest is the decision matrix to inform the decision as well. And I actually have a specific slide on that. And what that is compiling from the various requirements that came to us from the Hill and NSPM 33, those key areas that go with it. And in the case of DoD, some timelines that go with the review as well. So we're not trying to ding somebody who had collaborations and did international research 10 years ago when it was accepted, and we really wanted to try and do that. Things have changed both from a federal perspective and the DoD, so we're trying to make sure we put the timeliness and timelines with that. And the last one is that's part of that packet is the list. It's actually 2 lists. One's a list of problematic institutions that support unwanted tech transfer. And another one is a list of, at the time it was required, the term was Foreign Talent Recruitment Program, but it really translated into what's in CHIPS and Science Act as the malign Foreign Talent Recruitment Program. Go ahead, next slide, please. So some of the key takeaways from doing this policy is we absolutely need to preserve open science for the US and for our capabilities and for our economic security. That includes international collaboration. So that's one of the key things we are not trying to limit or inhibit, because we need those collaborations to bring the best ideas in to the advancement of science. The other key thing is from our policy is to mitigate potential conflicts, not do outright denials, unless there's something egregious found, and there's a couple of attributes in the risk matrix that we'll get to that. But that's to the maximum extent possible. One of the reasons we released the policy publicly was to be transparent and drive some consistency across the department. The other thing is that the department will not discriminate on the basis of race or national origin in any of our reviews, fundamental research, other things that are coming out, such as the small business innovative research, small business technology transfer reviews as well that are requiring. And as we mentioned, we're putting timelines on that. So in October of 2019, the then Undersecretary of Defense of Research and Engineering, Dr. Griffin, put a dear colleague letter out to academia stating that these are now problematic. There are problematic attributes, and we will be reviewing. So at least for the DoD, that is kind of a key date that we will be looking before and after for the attributes in our decision matrix that goes with it. And as always, we are clearly looking for feedback on both the matrix, the lists, and any feedback on the policy as well. And I have some contact information in an upcoming slide to do that, primarily through Dr. Nair's office, but mine is in direct support in kind of doing some of this reviews and risk matrix that goes with it. Go ahead, next, please. So for the decision matrix, we actually looked at 4 key areas. The timeliness and the foreign talent recruitment programs, the sources of funding from foreign countries of concern, when and where patents are applied for, and then the entities list. So the problematic actors and affiliations that go with it. So these are the key 4 areas within our decision matrix that we are doing. I'm not going to go over each one of the attributes that go with it. Feel free to go online and find it, and we're welcome to discussions and feedback that goes with it as well. And we also clearly, and this is something we worked with the interagency, is the definitions. What does affiliation actually mean, and what does association actually mean as well, just to be very clear. Go ahead, next, please. And for those who were not aware or tracking the requirement to the Department of Defense, it was from a section 1286 of the actually 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, also known as Public Law 115-232, which has been amended several times since then, is for the department to just develop these lists and put them out publicly for decision making. So there are 2, as I mentioned, one list of institutions in the PRC, Russian Federation, and other countries with characteristics, and a list of the talent programs that go with it. So in developing these lists, we actually needed to use publicly available information that could be shared with kind of the public and the institutions as to where this information came from. And that's why the citation comes from. At this point with this first list, we are actually required to update this annually, is from the entity lists or from clear cases that are cited in Justice Department court cases. And I believe you'll see on the list where those sources and resources came from. So these were put out both for the institutions to use, but also for our internal DoD components as they're actually working the decision matrix and working to do the fundamental research decision. Go ahead, next, please. I was going to leave it at that. If this is out there, this is how you can contact, and where also additional places where they are posted. Also on the second one down is the basic research office. My office that is supporting the due diligence and research security and protection is at that second one, and there's a number of resources there as well, in addition to this policy. And then finally, the location where you can find the release. With that, I look forward to the questions at the end. Over.
Thank you so much, Chris. We're going to move on to MIT and Greg Moffett.
Thanks very much. And I too would like to thank Sarah and Lisa and the co-chairs for inviting MIT's participation. My name's Greg Moffett. I'm the Chief Research Compliance Officer at MIT. I've been in the role for 3 years. In fact, I think today is my 3-year anniversary. And the office was actually newly created. It took some pre-existing offices, the Export Control Office, Conflict of Interest, Research Integrity, and an office we are standing up specifically on research security with kind of its principal view on cybersecurity, and co-located those offices under one structure. So I do want to thank you for the plug up front for the MIT strategy report. And again, it's specific in many respects to China, but in my role, I actually think of it as a way in which we're trying to proceed with respect to our engagements in all countries of concern. But China is clearly the one that presents kind of the most frequent issues that arise. What I'm showing you here, and this is the only slide I actually have, has to do with our elevated risk process. Much of this actually predates the report. In fact, virtually all of it predates the report, but it's the various ways through which MIT is looking at potential engagements, whether those are research opportunities or even gift opportunities, other engagements through, say, our industrial liaison program, which is not necessarily tied to any specific research, but just is some form of participation on the part of different corporate entities throughout the United States and throughout the world in kind of research and learning opportunities sponsored by MIT. So let me just kind of walk you through the various components of it. What we try and provide is compliance review on a case-by-case basis. We have one committee that looks specifically at kind of overall academic questions, and then we have, for a particular smaller set of cases, there's an evaluation by a very senior group of MIT officers. In addition to that, I mentioned briefly that we actually have a gift acceptance committee that was stood up not really originally for reasons having to do with international gift acceptance, but generally to make sure that we understand and are comfortable with the sources of philanthropy to MIT. That's I'm not part of that group. That's made up of a combination of administrators, faculty at both the senior level and more junior level, and they work on an ongoing basis to take a look at gifts and ask whether or not there are concerns, and to make sure that what we are willing to accept by way of philanthropy is consistent with the types of organizations, entities, individuals with whom we would want to be doing our research work. More specific to the research activities themselves, we've identified particularly any institutional activities involving organizations, personnel in China, the Russian Federation, and in Saudi Arabia as engagements that are worthy of scrutiny. But this first level of compliance, what we refer to as compliance plus review, is actually even broader than that. I sit on a group called the International Coordinating Committee. That does not include any faculty members. It's all administrators, but from different parts of the institute who, as institutional agreements come in where MIT would actually be a party to the agreement, and one of the other partners is from another country, we take a look at those and just determine whether or not, in light of the guidance that Chris was just talking about, and Sarah and other sources, that we make sure that we are comfortable with accepting that engagement. The ICC itself does not make yes/no decisions. What we do is we recommend to the Vice Provost for International Activities, Professor Richard Lester, who is one of the working co-authors of the MIT China Strategy Report. We recommend to Professor Lester, here's the way we think that we should proceed. He then has the ability to give an approval to certain things, or to, in a small set, to advance that to the senior risk group. The ICC works in very close coordination with our Washington office, which is part of the Office of the President of the Institute, as well as country specific experts, oftentimes from our political science and economics groups. We work with various ad hoc faculty committees, and obviously we're very, very concerned about what specific technology or other area of academic research is under consideration, because that will obviously change the evaluation depending on the sensitivity of the research area. And then I mentioned that a small number of cases, almost all of which relate to potential collaborations with China, and when the senior risk group started with Russia, although that candidly has now dwindled to virtually nothing, and within Saudi Arabia, those get evaluated by the senior risk group. I don't sit on the senior risk group. That's my boss, the Vice President for Research, Dr. Maria Zuber, as well as the General Counsel of MIT and Professor Lester, who I mentioned previously. They actually comprise the risk group. They do make yes/no decisions on whether or not MIT wants to go forward with specific types of research engagements. They will do that usually with the recommendation of the International Coordinating Committee, and then on a much more occasional basis, they will interact with the International Advisory Committee. The IAC is a group of very senior full professors, institute professors who've been around the institute for a long time, have a pretty good scope of the universe of MIT's research activities, who will weigh in on whether or not a particular engagement makes overall sense to MIT's academic mission. In evaluating any specific case that comes before the senior risk group, they will pretty much without exception invite the principal investigator and other members of the research team in for discussion before they make a decision as to whether or not it's something that the institute is comfortable moving forward to. Those results are typically reflected to the president and the provost of the institute, although as a practical matter, the decision is typically made at the level of the senior risk group. I don't think I've seen anything that's ever been taken beyond that group for kind of a further appeal, as it were. Let me just mention a couple other tools that we've put in place to try and help researchers. Obviously, we'd like to give people information as early as possible in order to help them make evaluations as to whether or not they want to proceed down a particular collaborative path. One of those tools, it's been in effect now for a little less than a year. We call the Informal International Collaborations Tool. The name is a little bit of a misnomer because for almost any reason, anybody who has access to kind of life behind our firewall, from any undergraduate, anybody at the Institute, can plug in some very basic information about an individual collaborator, the institute at which that person works anywhere in the world, a little bit about the specific proposed research, whether it's co-authoring a paper, more formal engagement, even travel to a conference. They can provide some very basic information, and a small team of folks will then take a look at that, use a couple basic tools. Principally, we rely on the visual compliance tool, and sometimes we'll do a little additional digging, and we'll give them a response as to whether or not we see particular risks that could be which could be presented by that collaboration. Again, keeping in mind, the evolving picture that's emerging from the various government agencies that Chris and Sarah have already spoken about. We've actually found that that's been a very helpful tool for people. There's been very little screaming about whether or not this is somehow or another infringing on people's academic freedom. It is entirely optional. They're not mandated to use it at this point. And so the reception for that has actually been pretty good. And it's been, I would say it's been pretty robust. The other thing that we've stood up more recently to try and assist researchers, and particularly the heads of departments, labs, and centers, is a tool by which we will evaluate visitors, whether they are visiting students or visiting scholars, working with our International Scholars Office and International Students Office to give an assessment as to whether or not a particular visitor coming to the Institute would be legally acceptable. Obviously, that's ultimately in the hands of the government. And then beyond that, whether or not the engagement might present a problem, usually because the person might be coming from an entity list organization or another organization that's been identified by the government as presenting particular concerns. So those are some of the processes, the tools that we're using at MIT these days. I'd be happy to take any questions when we come to the end of the section. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Craig. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you for inviting me to share some comments, really digging into a faculty perspective on all of this. And I think the best way to do that is to sort of put you inside of the faculty heuristic around research compliance. So Sarah, if you could share the next slide, that would be great. I really just wanted to give a very simple and high-level overview of the myriad of research regulatory issues that might affect faculty, and which they have an understanding of, because it is already existing within the landscape of risks that they think about often and that universities are well equipped to implement. So those very well known are very well understood by this group, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but of course it involves human subjects, occupational health, animal use and welfare, laboratory safety, the lab and center environment, just thinking in general about those pillars of a responsible conduct of research approach. So one part of the heuristic has to do with the landscape that faculty are already a part of in terms of the way in which they align their research activities with the already existing structural means of assessing, are they doing things in a copaesthetic way? Are they thinking about things in ways that protect all of the various interests that they have? I think it's really important to understand that this framework is primarily an investigator training and education framework. And it is also discipline of course, and experience specific. So the requirements that might exist for a trainee are very different from those of a junior faculty, and those in turn are maybe different from the responsibilities and roles that might be faced by senior investigator, a lab director, a department chair, and so forth. Next slide, please. I want to just point out that in research administration, and I really loved, by the way, the presentation from MIT a few minutes ago because of how thoughtful it is in developing and moving towards a systemic approach to making sure that there's an onboarding for faculty about how to make decisions. But most research offices have compliance apparatus around human subjects through their IRB offices, or around animal care and use through their IACUC programs, around biosafety, radiation safety, occupational health, and so forth. And I want to add, many faculty are already deeply engaged in managing these processes, much as we just saw in the MIT example, about how research risk related to international work is being managed there. So my point is, there's an already existing knowledge base and typically an institutional administrative structure to deal with these sort of well-known processes. But I want to point out again, the framework here is individual responsibility, it's protocol driven, and it's very specific kinds of research outlines that are born from the scientific work. And I think where a lot of confusion exists around the risks associated with international collaborations is that falls into a category of risk mitigation that doesn't neatly fit into disciplinary specific frameworks for how you look at risk. And it also takes many investigators particularly investigators in scientific fields of study, into the realm of policy and social interconnections and so forth, that they may or may not have an anchor to really understand, much in the same way that many of the HR requirements tend to be kind of difficult to wrap your arms around where to go and how to get support for those issues. Next slide, please. So I just want to list, kind of the less well-defined areas that I think many faculty struggle with in terms of how to incorporate what we at the institutional scale, I wear both hats, by the way, I'm at an institutional level and as a faculty, where we struggle for how to pull down those institutional concerns into our everyday practices. Of course, export control, which was talked about at length before. I think this area is just particularly fraught for faculty. And I've said this many times in FDP discussions before. The problem with export control for many faculty, I don't want to speak for all of us, and there are lots of faculty on the call who can share their perspectives here, is that we're trained from the onset to think about open science and collaboration. And many of us I'm a geographer, we're required to do international work and think about those international ties as an integral element of the science that we develop, of the research that we develop. And so adding a list of controls around something connected to a foundational area of our own training and outlook on how to construct a knowledge base is challenging for people to think about. And, for many, it's almost antithetical to, what our training as scholars has been up until this point. And so, thinking about how to connect the dots between the research security concerns that may exist, particularly in an open science environment, it's a little bit different if you're doing classified research, I realize, it just sort of is anathema. And I think for a lot of faculty, export controls, and particularly, around the HR piece, are just a very big challenge point. I think most faculty are not really familiar with how visual compliance, for instance, is actually happening at their institutions, and may not even realize that those steps are being taken. So there's also a transparency issue that we face. From an international collaboration risk, I think, again, faculty could benefit from very well-defined decision criteria to be able to apply to how they develop their collaborations. student recruitment, joint research, even publication processes. And again, that's a very cross-cutting kind of a set of concerns, and one that doesn't align with the already existing research compliance apparatus that many campuses have, although I know we're all developing our research security programs at larger institutions. I think a tricky one that may be less on the radar for this discussion, but one I want to raise, is a whole issue of mentorship and training best practices. Many faculty, myself included, work in an environment where it's heavily, there are lots of international collaborations, lots of international students and postdocs, and maybe something we need to really better understand is that what comes with that is a different training and perspective up until the point they enter into a US university environment. And so we have this sort of regulatory set of issues that may affect both the relationship between advisors and their trainees, but also may be applicable to that individual who's coming from another cultural and regional setting in the world, but doesn't have any real understanding of the policy environment in which they now work. Well, that's one thing if you're talking about how to recognize, a reagent in the lab that could have, a health risk. Well, that's something entirely different when you're talking about a policy environment, and for individuals who are really focused on trying to understand the landscape of their own institution. I work at this institution, I need to learn those policies. So thinking more broadly about, national interests is, I just think it's really out of step with the way in which education and training is experienced on the ground. And I think we need to really understand that mentorship piece and that training piece is a big part of the concerns that we have. And I could share some examples of that if we want to talk about those down the road. Similarly, we probably have less appreciation for the challenges of managing a lab and the lab environment that might ensue from those kinds of issues. I'm just thinking about expectations of conduct, just all of the, inclusiveness that we want to have in terms of best practices around how we comport ourselves. And again, that becomes very perspective and experience oriented. And there you go, when you have people coming from very, very different sets of expectations and perceptions. We touched a little bit about data handling and cybersecurity. I think this is actually a much larger, I'm sure everyone here understands the importance of this issue, and I'm not trying to minimize the focus that we have on it, but I think from a faculty standpoint, it is incredibly complicated to figure out how you can share information or how you might restrict the use of information, the systems that you might use, the cybersecurity risks that we all know about, but do people actually implement best practices? I just think there's a lot more attention and focus needed on giving clear guidelines and yet not impeding the ability for individuals to interact with each other. And I think international travel is equally fraught as a complex area that, unfortunately we understand what the risks may be, but I think we're not accounting for just how global our movements really are, both in our private spheres as well as our work spheres, and how those may or may not intersect, both for US individuals as well as individuals who are coming from other countries or have family overseas even. I just think that area is very challenging from a research security standpoint. And then I'll go into this one additional comment, which is that whereas research security around IRB, biosafety, animal care and use, radiation safety are typically coordinated under one umbrella, which would be research security. And this was, talked about earlier, in the MIT presentation, for many things connected to international matters, you're talking about multiple institutions, multiple components of a university coming together, but not necessarily with the expertise of the research environment. And, one can make assumptions about institutions. I think it's one environment at a research intensive institution. I think it's a very different environment around that specialization framework at institutions that are not necessarily as intensively research oriented in their overall focus. Next slide. So these are some thoughts for us to consider about that faculty perspective and heuristic that I want us to have top of mind as we think about what our risk strategies are, what tools we develop, and how we can work together to create a balance between managing the risks associated and continuing to support faculty to do what they do best, which is to discover and apply knowledge. So one, I think, is understanding exactly how it is faculty do connect to institution management structures, and understand that even at its most fundamental core, something like visual compliance is usually handled in an HR office, but faculty appointments are handled on the academic track. So faculty don't get oriented to that HR world, or at least not in my experience. And so you have these parallel structures that I think there's not a lot of good understanding about how they intersect, or even where the blind spots are on the part of faculty and other academic professionals. I think a second is to reduce ambiguity related to the risk associated with specific areas. And I think that ambiguity comes from a couple of things. I think one of those areas has to do with the scale of a particular issue. I think another has to do with scope, and I think a third has to do with the impact. And I think the challenge for any mitigation process is to help those, who you're trying to support, be able to put the concern in the right risk bucket in terms of their understanding. So I think it leaves us to, is it better for every faculty member to have export control training, or is it better for them to understand the specific concerns around data handling and around material transfers? Do they need to understand the policy framework, or do they need to understand the practical way to implement that in their lab? And I think that's something we just really need to put more attention on, because we as policy folk, and I consider myself in that lane, we think about that at a very high level, but down on the ground, people really need to have clear guidance about what things they need to be focused on in their everyday activities, so that they can meet us where we need to be met. I also think that to the extent institutional policies can align with funder requirements, you'll gain a much more stable structure. And again, I hope my faculty colleagues will make sure that I'm not misspeaking here from their experience. When I look at a grant, I go look at the policy framework listed in the RFP, not in the funding agency or OSTP guidances. I want to know, what does that funding agency say I have to do? And I hope to see a parallel structure at my institution that helps me check the box that says, yep, when it says I have to disclose international travel to these 3 countries, that I have a parallel process at the university that makes that so. But I think there's a gap often between what the specific requirement might be and how to navigate that at a home institution. And again, it goes back to, at many institutions, we're implementing these policies at an institutional scale, anticipating not just the researcher, but the whole of the university community. And that's totally understandable. We all have scarce resources. We want to make sure we develop structures that match and meet what the whole of the institution needs to be focused on. But from a research standpoint, that's often very confusing. So if my travel authorization process doesn't align with what the grant specifications are, then I'm still left to make a bunch of ad hoc decisions about what I do and don't do, what I do tell and what I don't tell. And that kind of goes along with my next statement, which is we really need to get very clear about the hierarchy of importance of our risks and communicate that. Is it more important to focus on ensuring at the time of hire that an individual has gone through a compliance check, Or is it more important that you look at the relationships of the faculty in your lab with international collaborators? Because if they're both the same, we also need to know that. And people then need to adjust, how they spend their time and allocate effort to be able to meet these needs. And finally, and I think perhaps most importantly, is that context really matters. And moving away from sort of broad stroke guidances into the specific applicability of those guidances, I think would do us well. So as a scholar who's a geographer, by definition, all we do is travel. That's what we do. We travel everywhere. No place, should be seen as something off limits. And I think it's important that we help to, hone in on what context really needs to be the focus for a specific risk. And those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We have survey results, but we wanted to just pause and take some time to answer the questions that you have. I do have some questions for the speakers, but I do also understand that we have some questions in the queue. So Mark Sweet is going to run through a couple of those questions for us. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, so the first question is really for Sarah. And I'll just read what it says here. Instead of using risk terminology, has NSF considered using decision support? So NSF would use a decision support rubric rather than risk rubric.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, we are absolutely still considering title process. We're very, very sensitive to kind of the connotation of risk and threat, et cetera. So yes, we haven't finalized and decided on an official title yet. And as you can see, I think DOD's like DARPA, Army, there was definitely mention of risk in some of those former decision matrix and risk rubrics and matrices, and now DOD is really kind of pivoted as well to the kind of that decision making kind of approach rather than kind of explicitly calling out risk. So yeah, it's very possible we may be shifting how we're going to be labeling that. So thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. And this next one, I think I'll direct to both Sarah and Chris. Will there be a preferred risk matrix required for certification of a research security program?
Chris, feel free to jump in. I mean, at this point in time, no, we are not considering that. Chris, do you have anything you want to add?
No, thank you. So part of this, I would hope, and this is something we're working at the interagency, is, and Sarah, you'll have to correct me in the name of the research security program that you're establishing. I know it's changed names. One of my opinions is, so part of it is also what is the risk tolerance level of each of the federal agencies as well. And so things that are in our decision matrix have dates specific to the DoD, where the other federal agencies may have different dates as well. So I know that's not, I'd hope we'd get consistent with our, what we consider for mitigation versus one system. As long as it took to get NSPM 33 approved, it's something I think we can try and strive for, but one right now I don't believe is going on the near-term horizon. Over.
And then maybe this is a little bit of a follow-up to that in terms of a risk or decision rubric. Is there going to be a coordination across the federal agencies to have sort of a standard approach here?
Chris, you want to go first and then I can piggyback?
I would hope so, because and the reason is reducing one, confusion, and two, drive consistency across both the federal government, but also to reduce the burden on our institutes of higher education. Absolutely understand the issue there, and I don't want to add anything there. Sarah?
Yeah, no, definitely. Chris, I think you said it very well. I mean, as you can see across the board, all of the research security policies that we are looking at as required under NSPM 33 implementation guidance, et cetera, we are trying to harmonize to the extent possible. I do think that there are likely going to be core factors across departments and agencies that we could be kind of taking into consideration. And perhaps that's something that we really need to kind of put our heads together and kind of publicize that as a baseline. But as Chris did also allude to earlier, that it's contingent on the mission of every single department and agency. It may differ a tiny bit, right? DoD compared to NSF. So I think identifying those core factors across agencies, I think we will strive for that. But there may be a little bit of variance contingent on mission. Over.
And I think as we get into the final section of this presentation, we'll touch a little bit on what FTP can do. But Greg, there's 3 questions that I have for you. And I do believe that the tool, the approach that you were talking about, that tool is not publicly available. Is that correct?
Correct. The informal international collaborations tool, Mark, is you need to have what we refer to as the certificate. That having been said, if there are folks who would want to get a little bit of a show and tell, I'll put my contact information in the chat. And depending on how many people, either I'll maybe arrange something to do for a group, or I can do a few individual things and show you how the thing works.
Yeah, Greg, I think that would be, let us know if there's a lot. Certainly the FTPR, the Research Security Subcommittee, could coordinate maybe a webinar or something if there's a lot of interest in that. And then
The
2 other
listening session. Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Well, I was just going to kind of go back to the timeline and how long it takes to do these reviews, and are they done at proposal stage, or where in the life cycle?
Yeah, let me speak somewhat theoretically. If everything goes well, if a matter is presented to the International Coordinating Committee, and it can actually come to the ICC in several different ways. Sometimes PIs will send them themselves. Sometimes it gets to Research Administration Services, or what a lot of universities refer to as OSP, and they'll send it to the ICC. They can come in different ways. But once the ICC gets it, we meet every other week. And we try to take anything that is in the hopper, we try and address it at least at some level at the first meeting where it's been introduced to us. Sometimes it'll take a 2-meeting cycle, but it's possible. We meet a lot of times on Tuesdays. Sometimes we'll get something on a Monday. We may have an answer back on Tuesday at the conclusion of the ICC meeting. We don't see any problem, we're going to recommend this go forward, or you really don't even need anybody's blessing on this, you're good to go. Sometimes, candidly, it comes in and it's just going to require some digging, some further research. It might take a few of those 2-week cycles to resolve it. And then there are outliers that just drag on for a while. The SRG, candidly, it meets once a month. Everybody's schedules allowing among the senior officers, and that's it's aspirational to some extent. Those matters are inherently more complicated. They may take a few months to really work out. Just real quickly, our goal with the IIC, that is the tool, right, is that if that comes into the research compliance group, our goal is we give some kind of an answer back to the requester within 1 business day. We don't always meet it, but I bet about 95% of the time we meet that goal. Do we have the definitive response for them? Not all the time, but usually we do.
Greg, thank you very much. You're following the chat. There's a lot of people who are interested, so maybe we'll talk about this offline and figure out if we can do more of a FDP sponsored webinar, so that you only have to do this once.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do it. Thanks.
There was a question for Michelle, which she answered in the chat, which I appreciate. I think with that, we're kind of caught up on all of the questions. So Lisa, if you want to go on.
Sure. And was there, I think there was one question that I might have seen in the chat about what the intent is around this new NIST research security framework. I understand, I've just taken a brief look, it's about 86 pages. So I guess, and I don't know if you know, but you know, what the thinking was behind that, you know, how they thought this framework might be put in place or utilized. And if you don't know, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, Lisa, I don't want to speak for NIST. I mean, I just, Greg Strauss is brilliant. And I just was chatting with him last Friday at another interagency workshop. And, you know, he actually, I hadn't even, I mean, there's so many things happening, right? That in a perfect world, we know everything and everybody's keeping on track of everything. But I just actually found out about this on Friday. So haven't yet read the 80 something pages, but have like definitely kind of worked through with him on, I think really kind of the rationale behind it from what he said is that just making this available, right? So everyone can leverage, and again, an effort to be transparent, provide the factors at which NIST is taking into consideration and providing that to the research community. So I think, I mean, really, I think that's the gist of it behind it, but happy to kind of follow up with Greg and get that an actual answer to the group if they'd like. Thanks.
No, I appreciate that. That's really helpful. Thank you. And thank you, Mark. So one of the questions I wanted to ask was, with respect to the DoD matrix, this would be for Chris. It focuses more on part A of the definition of malign in chips and science, but it does also talk about funding from a foreign country of concern or an FCOC connected entity. And it suggested that it's discouraged and it must be mitigated. So I just want to get a better understanding of what is being suggested there. Is it a concern if there's any funding from a foreign country of concern or a connected entity or related entity? And is that more related to outside activities versus kind of institutional agreements, such as those that are being reviewed by Greg and other institutions? And Chris, you are muted at the moment.
I apologize. I have 3 mutes on my machine. Thank you for the question. So with regards to the foreign countries of concern, recognize that the CHIPS and Science Act definition of malign foreign talent recruitment program does include those additional 3 attributes. Where we've chosen to incorporate most of that is in the 4th area, and that is incorporated into our section 1286 lists. So that does have the, instead of being very specific, saying everything in a country is problematic, what are the institutions and or the talent programs, to try and focus it down. That being said, when you talk about foreign countries of concern, the point there is if a key personnel or PI is getting direct funding from a foreign country of concern, that is something that I would hope that the institution is aware of and has their own policies and procedures in place, much like MIT just went over. But to assess the risk, and the department will also assess that as a risk as well. That is for direct funding. Now, if somebody also has a lemonade stand and they're getting funding from a foreign country of concern, that's probably not a risk. So that's one of the things that we just take into account in our decision that goes with it is where is the associated funding coming from, that they is disclosed. And if you see, also says undisclosed. So that's what I'm trying to get at, the making sure that things are disclosed in the new disclosure form that should be out soon, knock on wood. As well for the reviews. I hope that answers the question. Over.
That's helpful. Thank you. And I guess one question generally is with respect to agencies like DoD, for example, and even with institutions, for example, with MIT, is how you are relating or understanding the relationship between a foreign country of concern and an entity within that country. So I'm just I don't know if you have any information that you can share on how you try to make that connection or determine what that connection is.
I can try that one at least as a start. With regards to our decision matrix is trying to be clear that it's review of anything from the foreign country of concern. And then that's just to help make the decision that goes with it, versus an entity. And that's where the our list comes specifically into play of the federal government stating that these entities do have some kind of relationship or support some type of activity that we do not agree with. It is not a denial, but needs to be looked at from a decision standpoint. And that's why we provided it out to the institutes of higher education as well. For as you're establishing your research security programs, these are things that you might want to look at. Over.
All right, thank you. So from a relationship perspective with entities, I guess it comes back to the lists that you have published and broader U.S. government lists.
Primarily.
Okay. So I just want to, I have other questions, and I don't know, maybe other questions have come up in the chat, but I do want to just take a couple of minutes to let Alicia walk through the results of the survey that we issued last week. And again, we appreciate those that responded. So Alicia, if you want to go ahead and just take a couple of minutes, and then in follow-up, we can ask any additional questions regarding the survey or any of the previous presentations.
Definitely. Thanks, Lisa. And so if we'll move to the next slide, we'll see sort of who responded to our informal poll. So we had 62 respondents, and you can see the institutional classifications. The goal really was to see where people are now, what the greatest needs are, so that the research security subcommittee team can start looking at how to assist with addressing these needs. And so if we move to the next slide, the first question on the survey truly was about greatest needs for assessing, managing, and mitigating research security risks. You can see, although the responses were divided into sort of 4 different buckets, it really focuses on federal support and some additions that we need from federal partners, as well as institutional support. Looking at the enhanced federal guidance piece, a lot of the comments here talked about harmonization and clear guidance, highlighting where there are similarities and discrepancies between different agencies, very similar to the conversation that just occurred here. But again, putting information in a really clear, accessible way that people can then utilize. And that was the enhanced federal guidance piece. You can see also institutional support and institutional change in structure or culture were also mentioned. This aligns very closely with the comments that Michelle made around, making sure that the infrastructure is there, that there's the culture of risk assessment, that people know what they're supposed to be looking for, and that all of the tools that we're developing here, that everyone's university is developing, making sure that those align with the actual culture so that they can be used. What we saw is a lot of information about staff resources, staff training, and then making sure that we have clear guidance on the risks and truly how to mitigate them in the organization in which they're being assessed. And then lastly, again, aligns with the idea of needing to have better information from the federal government, specifically about emerging trends and actual resources that identify specifics. It was mentioned in Chris's presentation about the list that's being maintained, but having a central way of accessing that list and the Department of Justice court cases that he mentioned, having it all in a more centralized location was one of the highlights from the greatest needs area. Then if we move to the next slide, this question specifically talked about the resources and tools necessary to then address those identified gaps. And when we look at this again, the clarity of guidance and the support from the federal agencies to really make a consistent way of addressing this so that training can be developed was obviously the top with 16 respondents noting that. Again, the federal data where there's a central source of information, a consistent list of entities and parties that are considered risky. And one key point that I think kind of summarizes all the discussions that we've had here is specific information rather than vague concepts that can then be utilized to make checklists, a federal repository of some sort. I know that our federal partners are working on this really hard, and they're working to centralize internally before they bring it out. And you know, that was reflected in the comments, but there's still a great need to have better single stream of information around that. Then obviously a system or a sort of tool, dashboard, or checklist was noted. That goes under risk assessment tools. And then additional needs, and this mostly focused on peer institutions and leveraging information and processes and policies that peers have already done. So, you know, sort of like we saw here with information from Greg and Michelle around, you know, leveraging their expertise, things that they've already done. And, you know, the MIT tool is a really good example of that. So then when we jump to the next slide, we'll see the specific question then was about, do you already use tools? You'll see that out of the respondents, almost everyone except 5% said, no, we don't use tools. So either everybody's already developed some sort of tool or they're looking for tools. So again, I think this really just emphasizes the need for this community as a whole to help support that gap. And then if we transition from sort of the tool needs into looking at what practices are being assessed here, if we go to the next slide, we can see specifically questions about our institutions conducting risk reviews for international proposals and or non-monetary agreements. You can see that both for proposals and for non-monetary agreements, 50% or more of the respondents are doing a risk assessment. So this is a widespread practice, but and then another almost third are considering it. Some are doing it only for countries of risk, and those are listed at the bottom of the slide. As well as some respondents mentioned that they're using the embargoes list. So there's still some variance here around when people are doing reviews, but you can see that it is edging towards the majority are doing them or are wanting to do them, going back to the idea of needing to have some tools so that we reduce that administrative burden and time and the amount of staffing necessary. If we click to the next slide, then you'll see review and consultation services about external outside activity for international parties. And you'll see that over 74% of the respondents do provide some type of review, either as requested or when disclosures raise an issue. And then 14% of respondents actually require a review, with only 12% of the respondents saying that they don't require any type of review and are not providing these services. So again, a lot of institutions are already doing this work, and it often we'll see here at the end in non-centralized units. So if we then click to the next slide, you'll see that 43% of our, there's a 43% group that is using an informal process when they do conduct a risk review of either proposals, agreements, and or outside activities. And then over 57% of the respondents said that they do have a formal process. And of the 20 that make up that 57%, over 70% are qualitative or somewhat subjective. So it's not as established as the 30% that said they either have established review factors or they have established review factors and a process to quantify the risk that comes out of that. So you can see there's still some emerging processes that are happening there. Again, going back to the needs assessment that we saw at the beginning of this data, where there's a need for definition and consistency and tools around that. And then when the respondents were asked, if we go to the next slide, what the institution considers when conducting risk reviews and which are most impactful. The red highlighted ones were both the highest number of responses as well as the most impactful. Orange is slightly less impactful, and then the yellow was still voted as impactful, but least impactful. And then the ones that aren't highlighted did not receive any most impactful notes. But you can see that all of these factors are being considered in some way for some of the respondents. And so I think, looking at the variety of factors here and the variation in answers, again, having some guidance, the matrix that we've seen coming out from agencies, that probably will help us refine this as we go along, but still thinking about, the time and effort that people are putting in to do sometimes these qualitative instead of really set factor reviews. And then the last set of questions that we asked specifically around centralized risk review units are highlighted on the next slide. And if you look, we can see that of the individuals who responded here, 7 said yes, that they do have a new centralized risk assessment structure, director of research security or a research security type of program. But then the larger percentage of respondents actually said no, they did not have. And if we go to the last slide showing this data, you can see that out of the respondents, 18% said no. And then there's a variety of different offices that have been charged with handling a portion of the risk review, all the way from obviously central offices and some sub offices, often in central or finance, as well as a variety of compliance offices, legal, IT, some global services, and some departments. So it is very widespread. And again, going back to pointing towards, leveraging peer experiences and how things are going there. So that really is the summary of the poll data. As Lisa said, we appreciate everyone providing feedback to help us move forward. And I think we are ready for questions.
So thank you to you, Alicia, for putting all of this information together for us. It really is a wonderful presentation, and we all appreciate it. Mark, I have additional questions I could ask, but I wonder if there are more questions that came in.
There is one question. This one also is for Chris. Regarding the DoD policy, is Army Research Lab also subject to the new policy? And more importantly, will they stop asking PIs on basic research projects to sign the Privacy Act statement?
So no, great question. So the policy that Ms. Yu signed out is applicable to all fundamental research across the DoD. So we're having discussions with the Army. The Privacy Act is not about the decision matrix. It was more about the use of the information that they're obtaining. And that's what those list of activities are. So Dr. Nair and I are having discussions with all of the components about how they are implementing and ensuring that they're being implemented consistently. Even DARPA, that had the CFIP policy, are modifying their process based upon some of the tweaks that were made based upon Ms. Yu's memo as well. The thing with that is, just for clarity, is that policy came out in June. You will only start seeing it in the solicitations and those modifications starting this fall, because of the timing of translating the policy into the solicitations and the broad agency announcements that come out. Over.
All right, thank you. Lisa, I believe that is it for the questions in the chat.
I'll ask a quick question, super easy. I'll ask Chris and Sarah, and then we can go ahead and wrap up. But just, if you have an investigator, for example, just thinking about like blurry lines, right, and gray areas. So if you have an investigator and they have an opportunity for to be a visiting professor at a Chinese institution, and, it does involve funding, it involves research, publications and the like. there's no conflict of interest, there's no conflict of commitment, they're not on an entity list, et cetera, right? It's above board. But it's research being conducted at a university in a country of concern. It's an affiliation. What would you say in terms of, I mean, it's more subjective, and that, I guess, is going to be assessed based on, the agency's, risk review or assessment of how risky that is. And that's going to vary from agency to agency. But do you have any advice, I guess, if, again, it doesn't violate any kind of federal policy or term and condition, but could it be viewed as sufficiently risky that an individual might not receive federal funding?
Lisa, I'll be happy to take that, and Chris, again, chime in from DoD's perspective. I mean, yeah, Lisa, I mean, what you outlined, I mean, from NSF's perspective, I mean, appointments, funding from foreign countries of concern, a visiting scientist, it's allowable for NSF as long as they, don't qualify. There's no relationship with a malign foreign talent recruitment program specifically, but in this case, what you've outlined, I don't think there would be. And as long as they're disclosing, right? As long as they're forthcoming with the information, if there's no conflict of interest, no conflict of commitment, this should be an allowable activity. So, I mean, I know, we definitely don't want people kind of shying away from legitimate international collaboration, right? This is something that I think many of us across the board, are kind of concerned about, and because there is a little bit of ambiguity. But again, from NSF's perspective, with no nefarious connections and reporting all the information, that would absolutely be allowable. Thanks. Chris, you might want to add something from your perspective.
No, I absolutely concur. And as long as it also meets the institution's policies with regards to such type of activities as well. Over.
I'm really glad you raised that issue, Chris, because it may be allowable, but is it possible? And that possibility stems from, such rules as not bringing cell phones and laptops to China, which many universities prohibit, not logging into your home systems when you do your work abroad. So it may be fundable from an NSF standpoint, but is it implementable, at universities based on other regulations that still meet, all of the requirements? That's the challenge I think faculty are having, is sort of wrapping, their brains around, well, but what part of this can I actually engage that doesn't trip me up in other ways?
That's really helpful information in terms of the funding agency perspective on that is appreciated and helpful. So thank you. Well, thank you to all of our speakers. I see that we've gone past time. This was a really great discussion. We really very much appreciate your participation, and thank you to all.
And thank you, Lisa, for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you all.
All the organizers, actually.
Take care.
Bye,
Take
everyone.
care.